This is the Church of St. Paul in the Desert.
In the name of God, Amen. Please be seated. I have a confession to make. When I first read this gospel this week, I looked at it and I thought, now, somewhere in the nether reaches of my brain, somebody wrote some music, and they called it Dives and Lazarus, or Lazarus and Dives. Well, finally, after most of the week had gone by and I'd searched and hunted, Ralph Vaughan Williams wrote the 5 variations on Dives and Lazarus, so that settled that one. But we have 3 lessons here today that actually have an interrelatedness, which is unusual to say the very least about it. There's several other parts of it that are, I think, worth mentioning. In all the parables of Jesus, this is the only time that a character is named by name, Lazarus. And I began to think about that in and of itself. But even in the midst of all that, there is this sense that there is something much more going on. Now, Paul, or the author of 1 Timothy, talks and uses that phrase that we've all used at some time or another, money being the root of all evil. But the reality is that it's not so much money being the root of all evil. It tends to be much more about what we do with money. What we do with money. How do we use it? How do we recognize? How do we acknowledge? And in the course of looking at some material with regard to this passage from the Gospel of Luke, found an example that is really quite profound. Most of you know there was, at the turn of the century, probably one of the foremost theologians and concert organists. He actually had 3 PhDs, one in theology, one in medicine, and one in philosophy. He was also probably the foremost concert organist in Europe at the turn of the century, had a teaching position in Austria, in Vienna, the University of Vienna. And he admits that, in fact, this gospel passage was the moment in time that transformed his life. And he left all that he had and went to Africa and became a missionary. And the only thing that he could play on was a piano that was lined with zinc because nothing else would take the tropics quite that way. Albert Schweitzer being that individual. But acknowledging this passage as that which transformed his life, turned him around. We at times think about such events, but I think that part of what I find troubling about this passage for me is how it really is not just about long ago and far away, but it is about the world in which we live today. Because the real issue is Dives, the rich man, didn't even know that Lazarus sat there in his pain and agony. He was, if you will, one of those transparent people, or Dives just looked through him. We encounter it in every community, this community, Banning, doesn't matter. There are those individuals that we look through because they make us uncomfortable. They make us uncomfortable. Their abject poverty and their lack and their need. And so we want to look through them. I can remember on one of my first trips to San Francisco years ago, and someone said, well, just ignore those beggars and people on the street. And then I realized you can't do that. They're human beings. They're human beings. We've just gone through a period of time, and the economists in Washington have now told us that the recession is over, in case anybody was interested. That may not be our experience, but somehow the economists have told us that it's no longer an issue. One only has to have picked up the papers in the last 3 months. I think it was one Saturday morning, about 2.5 months ago, that I opened the paper and began reading about the community of Bell. The community of Bell. I have a friend who happens to work in the DA's office in Los Angeles and was a little involved in that. And in a conversation I had this week with him, he mentioned that one of those fine, upstanding individuals was also a pastor at an evangelical Protestant church, volunteered, you know. The issue there is the incredible abuse of the fiduciary responsibility. A city that is made up predominantly of working class folk, blue-collar folk, many immigrants, and had a tax base that was higher than Pasadena, Beverly Hills, Santa Monica, and somehow it happened. Now, some may say, well, they got their comeuppance this week, but the people have suffered incredibly. Incredibly. It's what we do with money. We can say that it is the root of all evil, or we can say it can be an incredible gift. What do we do with our money? Where do we put our money? Our values are signified by where we put our money. Andrew Carnegie, one of the wealthiest men of the last century, or actually 2 centuries now. I always forget that we've gone through another century. One of the wealthiest men in the world. In his lifetime made well over $300 million, $500 million. He gave away 99.5% of his wealth. There are libraries across this country that were built by Andrew Carnegie. I was beginning to be a little worried about my own generation or the next generation. The me generation, it's all about me, and all proclaiming that wonderful idiom of Miss Piggy, the one with the most goodies wins. That was kind of the pervasive methodology of a generation. But this past week, somebody who is much in the news, there's just been a movie made about him, Mark Zuckerberg, founder of Facebook, at 26, already has amassed a fortune of $500 billion. But has given $100 million, or is in the process of giving $100 million to the Newark, New Jersey school district for education. Profound, amazing. What do we do with our money? How do we value that? Albert Schweitzer, brilliant theologian, concert pianist. I have to serve. I have to go. I have to do for others.